explores real survival stories and forgotten techniques used by settlers, Native Americans, outlaws, homesteaders, and trappers to endure the unforgiving winters of the American frontier. Each story dives into a specific setting, community, or individual's experience with detailed narration, historical insight, and immersive atmosphere to help listeners fall asleep while learning. Winter at Fort Phil Kearny, a garrison on the edge of survival. The wind didn't whistle on the plains of northern Wyoming. It screamed, especially in December. The air tore through the pine-studded ridges and bare stretches of prairie like a predator, looking for any gap in a uniform, any crack in a cabin wall. If you stood outside Fort Phil Kearny at dawn, your breath would hang in the air so long it felt like it was frozen in place. Soldiers posted on sentry duty learned quickly to keep moving. Those who didn't lost fingers, or worse. The year was 1866, and Fort Phil Kearny was one of 3 U.S. Army outposts along the Bozeman Trail, a shortcut for settlers and gold seekers pushing north to Montana. But to the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes, that trail sliced through sacred hunting ground. The fort was never just a fort. It was a provocation, an open insult, and every man stationed there knew it. Colonel Henry Carrington, commander of the 18th Infantry, had been ordered to build and hold the fort with a force of just over 400 soldiers and civilian laborers. Most of them weren't seasoned fighters. They were green recruits from eastern cities, unused to horses, firearms, or frontier winters. When the snow started falling in early November, it didn't stop. By the first week of December, they were wading through waist-deep drifts just to carry firewood from the stockpile to the mess hall. And firewood was running low. The fort sat in hostile territory, surrounded by timber-rich hills. But cutting trees wasn't simple. The wood-cutting details had to be guarded by armed escorts, and every trip beyond the palisade was a risk. Lakota warriors, led by Red Cloud, were watching, waiting. Skirmishes were frequent, arrows from the tree line, shots from unseen rifles. Even the act of gathering fuel for a stove could become a firefight. Inside the walls, the fort was still unfinished. Logs for the perimeter palisade had arrived late. Many of the barracks had open chinks between the logs, unsealed by chinking or moss. Men tacked up blankets, but the wind blew right through. Frost formed on the insides of tent walls. Frost formed on men's beards. Water froze in the buckets inside the cookhouse, just a few feet from the stove. Cattle brought in to feed the garrison had to be slaughtered quickly because if left outside overnight, they froze solid. The army issued wool uniforms, but most weren't built for sub-zero nights. Some men wore the same boots for weeks without taking them off, because removing them meant struggling to get them back on over swollen, frozen feet. Frostbite crept up toes and fingers like a silent infection. The fort's surgeon, Dr. Hines, had already amputated 2 fingers and 3 toes before New Year's. Even so, the men still drilled. Colonel Carrington insisted on discipline, especially with morale already strained. He organized patrols, inspections, and rifle training in the snow. It kept the soldiers moving, and moving meant staying alive. Complaints filtered through the ranks, but no one disobeyed openly. They understood the cost. Mail arrived sporadically, usually frozen into solid blocks, and sometimes months late. Letters from wives, sweethearts, or parents were read by candlelight in the freezing dark. The few books in the fort's possession were passed around like sacred texts. Chessboards, decks of cards, even scraps of newspapers were worth their weight in gold. But even distractions couldn't erase the sound of wolves in the distance or the growing fear that the next attack might come during a blizzard. The worst part wasn't the hunger or the cold. It was the waiting, the silence between skirmishes, the uncertainty about when the next assault would come, or whether supplies would arrive from Fort Laramie, 236 frozen miles away. The telegraph line wasn't built yet. News traveled by courier, and couriers froze too. One night, the northern lights lit up the sky like a ghostly fire above the hills. Men stepped outside the barracks and stared, teeth chattering, wondering if it was some kind of omen. They didn't speak. What was there to say? The plains didn't care if you were a farmer, a warrior, or a soldier. Out here, winter was the real enemy. By mid-December, the temperature at Fort Phil Kearny routinely dipped below zero. The wind chill could push it to 30 below. Every man in the garrison came to understand one simple rule. Fire wasn't a luxury. It was the line between life and death. But fire needs fuel, and that's where things got complicated. The fort was surrounded by pine and fir forests, but the soldiers couldn't just walk out with axes and start chopping. Red Cloud's war party had made that clear. Every woodcutting detail, usually a mix of soldiers and civilian contractors, had to be guarded by heavily armed escorts. These wood trains, as they were called, became frequent targets for ambushes. Warriors waited in the hills, hidden behind snowy ridges and trees, watching for columns of men and mule carts making their way into the forest. The U.S. Army knew this, but it had no choice. Without wood, the stoves would go cold. Without stoves, men would freeze. Each morning, just after dawn, a dozen or more men would head out in formation, cutters in the middle, riflemen on the flanks. They wore snowshoes or plodded through waist-deep drifts, depending on the trail. The axes rang out in the woods for hours at a time, echoing like gunfire. The guards scanned the tree line constantly, nervous fingers on cold triggers. When the sleds were loaded with logs, the men turned back toward the fort, exposed and vulnerable. Arrows had already taken 2 woodcutters that week. 1 mule had been killed outright. Another ran off into the trees, never seen again. Every foot of timber came at a cost. Inside the walls, the wood was rationed carefully. Officers had stoves in their quarters, but enlisted men huddled in poorly heated barracks, 6 to a bunk in some cases, wrapped in every blanket they had. The stoves, when lit, barely made a dent in the cold. Most men slept in their uniforms, boots included. You could wake up to frost inside your tent, even if the fire had been burning all night. Wool was everywhere. Wool blankets, wool undershirts, wool socks, wool trousers. But even wool has limits. Wet wool especially could kill. Soldiers learned not to sweat if they could help it. Once your underclothes were soaked, drying them was next to impossible. You could hang them near the stove for hours, but the moisture clung, that damp chill, against bare skin in sub-zero air was a quiet kind of misery. A few soldiers got creative. They stuffed extra straw between the lining of their jackets. Others lined their boots with newspaper or wrapped their feet in rags soaked in animal fat to retain heat. One corporal sewed rabbit fur onto the inside of his gloves after trading with a local trapper. It wasn't standard issue, but it worked. The officers noticed. Some encouraged it. Others turned a blind eye. After all, regulations didn't matter much when your toes were turning black. The fort's cookhouse was another critical zone. It ran hot for most of the day, but the heat didn't go far. Food was basic: hardtack, beans, salted pork, and dried fruit if you were lucky. But warm stew in a tin cup could lift morale like nothing else. The smell alone made men forget, for a few minutes, just how bitter the wind was outside. To stretch supplies, Carrington ordered daily inventories. Every cord of wood was counted, every crate of coal. He even assigned men to monitor stove use, which made them unpopular, but kept others from sneaking extra fuel. Fires were never left unattended. Sparks were dangerous in wooden buildings, packed with freezing men. One accidental blaze could gut a whole barracks and leave dozens exposed. And then there was the matter of light. Candles were precious. Oil lamps, too. Most men did without. After sunset, the fort sank into a sort of suspended gloom. Men lay in silence, wrapped in blankets, speaking little, breath fogging in the dark. Only the occasional crack of a stove or the distant howl of wolves broke the stillness. When there was time, some men carved, some played cards, some simply stared into the fire until sleep came. But there was an edge to the quiet. Everyone felt it. They knew the cold wasn't just discomfort. It was a force, relentless, patient, and it didn't care who you were. Some nights, the wind screamed loud enough to shake the window frames. The men would pull their coats tighter, press closer to the fire, and hope the woodpile would last till morning. Because when the fire went out, there was no backup. December 21st, 1866, was clear and bitterly cold. The snow had stopped falling the night before, but it left a hard crust over the hills around Fort Phil Kearny. Men walked with their heads down, boots crunching over ice. It was the kind of day where even sound seemed to freeze. Just after breakfast, the alarm was raised. Lakota warriors had attacked a wood train just 3 miles from the fort, near a rise called Lodge Trail Ridge. Colonel Carrington, as usual, prepared a rescue force. He had done this before: attack, withdrawal, ambush. It was a familiar pattern. A dozen times he'd ordered restraint and caution. This time, he chose Captain William Fetterman to lead the relief party. Fetterman was new to the West, a Civil War veteran with a reputation for bravery and a hunger for action. He had no experience fighting Plains tribes, but he was ambitious, and he made no secret of his opinion that Carrington was too cautious. Fetterman had a standing boast: with 80 men, I could ride through the whole Sioux nation. Now he had 79. The rescue column was made up of infantry, cavalry, and a few civilians. Among them was Lieutenant Grummond, also eager for glory, and 2 scouts, James Wheatley and Isaac Fisher, frontiersmen who knew the land and the people better than any officer in uniform. Carrington's order was clear: do not pursue the enemy beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. It was a hard boundary. Beyond that rise, the terrain dropped into blind ravines and narrow defiles, perfect places for an ambush. Fetterman nodded, said he understood. Then he rode out. The attack on the wood train had already ended. It was bait, just like before, but this time the trap was bigger, colder, and perfectly laid. The column moved fast, too fast. As they neared Lodge Trail Ridge, Scouts warned Fetterman to slow down. He ignored them. Once over the ridge, they descended into a series of snowy draws out of sight of the fort. And then the world exploded. Hundreds of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, some estimates say over 1,000, sprang the trap. It wasn't a skirmish. It was slaughter. The soldiers were surrounded on three sides, pinned against the icy hills, with no cover and no room to maneuver. The fight lasted maybe 30 minutes. Later, when a recovery party arrived, what they found shocked even the hardiest men in the fort. All 81 men. Fetterman, Grummond, the civilians, the scouts were dead. Most had been killed with arrows and lances. Ammunition belts were empty. The soldiers had fought to the last round. Fetterman's body was found alongside his men, rifle clutched in frozen hands. The fort fell into stunned silence. There was no relief force to send, no backup coming. They dragged the bodies back through the snow in wagons, teeth clenched, eyes forward. It took hours. Back at the garrison, the dead were laid out in rows. Burial in the frozen ground was almost impossible. The men used picks and axes to hack at the soil. When they couldn't go deep, they packed snow and stones over the graves. Wolves came anyway. Guards were posted. The Fetterman fight changed everything. Carrington was removed from command weeks later. Some blamed him for not reinforcing the column. Others blamed Fetterman for disobeying orders. But the truth was more complex. It was pride, inexperience, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what winter warfare in the West truly meant. Because out here, snow wasn't just weather, it was strategy. The tribes knew that. They used it. They counted on the cold to slow the enemy, to isolate them, to cover their tracks. The army hadn't adapted yet. It still fought with Eastern eyes. In the aftermath, morale in the fort crumbled. Fear settled in like frost on the windows. No one left the stockade without escort. Patrols shrank. Even wood details were reduced to half their size. The men barely spoke of it. They didn't have to. Every gust of wind over the ridge reminded them. They'd seen what winter could do when paired with a cunning enemy, and they knew now survival wasn't just about firewood and blankets. It was about humility, about listening, about knowing when not to ride over the ridge. Blizzard on the plains, homesteading in Dakota Territory. It started with a stillness, that strange hush before the sky falls. The wind died, the birds vanished, and then came the snow. The first blizzard hit in mid-October, a surprise even for Dakota Territory. It came fast, heavy, and wet, laying down nearly 2 feet of snow in a single day. Some homesteaders hadn't even finished building their roofs. Some still had windows open to the prairie. The ground wasn't frozen yet, but that would change quickly. What no one knew then was this was just the start. The winter of 1880 to 1881 would become one of the most punishing in recorded American history. Imagine a small wooden claim shanty out on the prairie. No trees for shelter, no neighbors for miles. A dug well, a root cellar, and maybe a wagon. Inside that shanty, a family of 6, a single cast iron stove, cracks in the walls stuffed with newspapers and corn husks, blankets nailed over the windows, a month's worth of food, if that. Now bury that shanty in 12 feet of snow. The storms came weekly. Blizzards that howled like wild animals and turned daylight to pitch black. The snow didn't fall straight. It whipped in horizontal sheets, piling up against doors, pushing through every unsealed crack in the walls. The wind was so strong, it drove ice particles under the shingles and through keyholes. People learned not to go outside unless they tied a rope from the door to the barn. Otherwise, they'd vanish in the whiteout and freeze before they found their way back. Children were trained to stay put no matter what. If a cow broke out of the barn, let it go. If a fence blew down, let it fall. Survival meant staying inside. Inside, life slowed to a crawl. Days bled together. Time was measured by when the stove needed feeding or when the wind shifted directions. Snow piled against the house so high that families had to shovel tunnels just to reach the outhouse if it hadn't collapsed under the weight. In some cases, they didn't bother. They used buckets or nothing. Food was a slow-burning anxiety. Most homesteaders canned vegetables, smoked meat, and filled cellars with flour and dried beans. But no one had prepared for 5 months of deep snow. Wagons couldn't get through. Trains froze on the tracks. And when the wind cleared, the tracks disappeared under drifts 10 feet deep. By December, rationing had begun. By January, many families were boiling old leather belts or grinding wheat by hand to stretch the last sack of flour. Butter was gone. Coffee was replaced with roasted corn. The luxury of sugar became myth. And then came the stillness again. Between storms, the world looked dead. A flat, endless sheet of white. No motion, no color, no sound. The silence was surreal, beautiful, in a way, but terrifying, because it reminded you just how far you were from help. Isolation was the real enemy. It got into people's minds. There were no phones, no mail. If your nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, you might go weeks without seeing another face. Cabin fever wasn't a joke. It was a real, creeping kind of madness. Some homesteaders later said that they feared their own thoughts more than the cold. Children coped in strange ways. They sang to themselves. They carved pictures into the frost on the windows. Some even played blizzard games, pretending they were pioneers stuck in a storm, not realizing how close to the truth they really were. Adults leaned into routine. The stove had to be tended constantly. If it went out, relighting it could take hours, and the temperature inside could drop below freezing in less than 1. Water would freeze in the pail next to the bed. Ink froze in the inkwell. Bread dough wouldn't rise. And always the sound of the wind. It crept under the door like a whisper. It shook the walls. It rattled the chimney. And sometimes it screamed so loud that families had to shout to hear each other across the table. But they held on, one storm at a time, one bitter week after another, because they believed, somehow, that spring would come, that the thaw would find them, and when it did, they would dig out, rebuild, and plant again. They had no choice. By mid-January, food wasn't just running low, it had become a daily calculation, a mental arithmetic of survival. Most homesteaders on the Dakota Prairie entered winter with what they thought was enough. Maybe 2 barrels of flour, some dried beans, salt pork, a jar or 2 of preserved apples. But after 8 blizzards, a collapsed barn roof, and no wagon traffic for miles in any direction, enough stopped meaning anything. Bread was the first to go. Flour became more precious than gold. Every cup was measured with nervous precision. Women stretched dough with cornmeal, mashed potatoes, even sawdust in some cases. Hardtack, the rock-hard biscuit more often associated with soldiers, made a comeback. Baked with flour, salt, and water, it had no flavor and chipped more than a few teeth, but it stored well, and when soaked in hot water or milk, it was edible enough. That was the bar, edible enough. Meat, if it was left at all, had to be carefully rationed. A single smoked ham might need to last 2 months. Families cut it thin. Some boiled it to make broth, then reused the same water again and again, calling it soup. If there were beans, they were cooked down until soft and served plain. Salt was used sparingly. Sugar was gone. Butter was gone. Coffee had been gone for weeks, replaced by roasted barley, burnt bread crusts, or in some cases browned carrots. The taste didn't matter. It was the warmth that counted. But hunger wasn't the only battle. The cold, always present, always creeping in, demanded just as much ingenuity. Insulation was whatever you had. Some families used buffalo hides if they'd been able to afford or trade for them. Others nailed quilts to the walls. Rag rugs were pressed into door frames. Corn husks were stuffed between logs. Anything that slowed the wind was welcome. Windows were the weak point. A few families had glass panes. Most didn't. They used waxed paper, animal skins, or simply boarded them over for the season. Sunlight was a luxury, but heat was survival. Every tiny opening became a threat, not just to comfort, but to life. When it got bad, families huddled into a single room. They moved all their bedding to the warmest corner, usually near the stove. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, all slept together under every blanket they owned. They called it nesting. Body heat was the only reliable insulation left. Washing was a problem. Water froze in the bucket, froze in the wash basin, and sometimes froze in your hair. Laundry froze stiff before it could dry. Most people simply stopped washing altogether. Baths were out of the question. You didn't undress unless absolutely necessary. You layered. You wore socks to bed. You slept in yesterday's shirt and the day before's long johns. There was no shame in it, just pragmatism. And then there were the children. Keeping them warm was one thing. Keeping them sane was another. The endless confinement tested their nerves. They ran out of things to play with, toys to touch, stories to tell. Some drew in the frost on the windows. Some played with wood scraps or string. Others watched the stove and waited for something, anything, to happen. Parents did what they could. They told Bible stories. They recited poems. They assigned chores just to give the day some shape, but it wore on everyone. Then came the small accidents, the daily risks that winter made lethal. A slip on an icy threshold could break a hip, and with no doctor for hundreds of miles, that could be fatal. A child wandering outside without gloves could lose fingers. A stove that burned too hot might crack, and if it couldn't be repaired, the fire would go out. That was the nightmare. A failed stove in the middle of the night. No fire, no backup. Most families kept a storm pile inside the house, a small reserve of dry wood and kindling, just enough to restart the stove if something went wrong. It was guarded more carefully than anything else. Children were taught not to touch it, ever. The root cellar, if it could be reached at all, held the last of the potatoes and onions. But getting to it meant digging out a door buried in snow, descending slippery steps, and praying the stored goods hadn't frozen. Some did. Root vegetables that froze turned to mush when thawed, useless. Others, like cabbage and carrots, survived longer. By February, some families were boiling their own seed corn, grain they were supposed to plant in the spring. Eating it now meant no crop later, but if they didn't eat it now, they might not be alive to plant anything. That was the calculation. Every meal carried a cost, not just for the day, but for the season ahead. Still, they endured. They made coffee out of twigs and crusts. They lined their coats with scrap cloth. They dug tunnels through snowbanks to reach the barn, and they kept the fire going. Because as long as the fire burned, there was still a tomorrow to reach for. By March, people had stopped guessing when it would end. The storms had blurred together into one long frozen siege. Outside, snow still drifted high against doors and windows, hiding homes like tombs. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, silence, and the sour smell of boiled grain. Most families were down to the last of everything. The final potatoes, the last jar of jam, the piece of soap shaved thin enough to see through. No more butter, no more flour. The coffee substitute had already been used 3 times. The ashes in the stove bin were warm only because someone stirred them. And still the wind came. The physical challenges had become routine. It was the mental ones that frayed people's edges. The sameness of each day. The sense that time had frozen with the rest of the world. That maybe spring wouldn't come at all. That maybe this was it. Life now a fire, a storm, a cold room with gray light and no way out. Parents hid their fears behind routine. They got up. They lit the fire. They scraped the frost off the water pail. They boiled whatever they had. They told the children to fetch wood or sweep the same floor they'd swept yesterday. The structure was everything. It kept the panic in check. Some families prayed more. Others stopped praying altogether. A few neighbors, if they lived close enough, dared to travel by foot just to check on one another. These short visits meant more than any meal. They were proof that the world outside still existed, that someone else was enduring too. There were tragedies. A man froze trying to reach town. A woman lost a baby and couldn't bury it until April. A child, delirious with fever, wandered out into the snow one night and was found too late. These stories passed from homestead to homestead, each carried with a quiet shake of the head and a glance at the window. But there were moments of grace, too. One family shared their last ham with a neighbor whose cow had died. Another let a single mother and her 2 boys move in, tripling the number of mouths to feed. But they did it anyway, because this wasn't survival in isolation. It was survival through shared effort, even if the sharing meant less for everyone. The thaw began slowly. First, a day with no snow. Then, a patch of sky. Then, water trickling down the inside of the well shaft. The sun felt warmer, even if it wasn't. The wind stopped biting for an hour. Birds returned. Not many, but enough to hear. A single crow. A lark, maybe. The roads were still buried. Wagons couldn't move. The telegraph lines were down. But inside the shanties, inside the one-room cabins and dugouts, people began to hope again, carefully, quietly. One morning, a boy stepped outside and sank only ankle deep. He ran back inside and told his mother. She cried. When spring finally came, it didn't rush in. It revealed itself in patches, a thawed fence post, a trickle under the snow, a crow's nest on a bare branch. Then, almost suddenly, mud. So much mud you could sink to your knees trying to cross your own yard. The first wagons didn't bring much. Some coffee, some mail, a few supplies, but they brought word from the rest of the world, from towns that had also gone dark for months, from other families who had survived, and from a government that too late understood what had happened. The Great Blizzard of 1880-81 entered the history books, but for those who lived through it, there was no need for headlines. The season was carved into their bones. It taught them what cold really was, what hunger could do, what silence meant when it stretched for weeks, and what it took to hold on when everything, absolutely everything, was telling you to let go. They came out gaunt, worn, half in disbelief, but they came out and they planted again, because that sips what you did. You dug out, you put seed in the ground, and you hoped the next winter would wait just a little longer before it came calling. Trappers of the Rocky Mountains, alone with the wolves, their sips cold, and then their sips mountain cold. Not the kind that stiffens your fingers or makes your nose run, the kind that strips the heat from your body like steam off a kettle, fast, invisible, and without mercy. The kind that makes your bones ache even when you're still. And that's the cold mountain men faced. Year after year, winter after winter. These were fur trappers, the solitary traders, hunters, and scouts who wandered deep into the Rockies in the early 1800s. Men like Hugh Glass, Jim Bridger, Kit Carson, and 100 others whose names didn't make it into books. They followed rivers upstream until the trees thinned and the sky grew hard. They set traps along frozen creeks, shot beaver for pelts, and built shelters where no help would ever reach them. And when the snow came, they stayed. There were no cabins waiting for them, no stocked cellars, or log burners, or cozy bunks. If you were smart, you'd already started prepping in September, because by November, the high passes would be closed with snow so deep it swallowed horses whole. Your survival kit was whatever you could carry: a flintlock rifle, a tomahawk, a knife, a tinderbox, maybe a tin cup. For warmth, a buffalo robe if you were lucky. More often, just layers of buckskin and fur. Deer, elk, wolf, beaver, anything that trapped heat and shed water. Trappers weren't just hunters. They were craftsmen. They made their own snowshoes, stitched their own moccasins, patched holes in their clothing with sinew, not thread. They slept in lean-tos, made of pine boughs or under overhanging rock. When it snowed, they dug down into the drifts to escape the wind. Some built wickiups, dome-like shelters made of willow branches and hides, borrowed from Native American designs. Smoke holes were carved into the top so a fire could burn barely inside. The heat from a small flame, trapped under layers of fur and brush, could mean the difference between waking up or not. Food was another thing entirely. Beaver trapping slowed in winter. So did elk. Snow muffled sound and made stalking prey harder. You might survive for days on pemmican, a dense slab of dried meat and fat, or boiled rawhide from old saddles. You'd eat what you shot, sure, but you'd also eat what you caught in snares, what you dug out of burrows, what you could scrape from frozen bones. Snow was your water, ice was your cup. You melted it slowly over the fire, using hot rocks if you had no pot. Drinking from rivers wasn't always an option. Many froze solid, and falling through the ice, that wasn't something you came back from. There were stories, always stories, of men who went snowblind, eyes burned by days of white glare, stumbling half-mad through the trees, of others who lost their feet to frostbite and walked out of the mountains anyway, wrapped in rags, using their rifles as crutches, and of some who just disappeared, buried by avalanches or frozen in their sleep, discovered months later by the next trapper who passed that way. But still they went, because the pelts were worth it. A single prime beaver could bring $2 or $3 in St. Louis, more if the market was good. And beyond the money, there was something else, a kind of pride, a silence that most men couldn't stand, but some came to crave. No orders, no clocks, no boundaries but the horizon. Wolves followed them sometimes, coyotes too. They circled their camps at night, just outside the firelight, not always as threats, sometimes just as reminders. You weren't at the top of the food chain out here. You were just one more animal in the cold. When a storm rolled in, there was no sheltering in place. You moved, fast, to lower elevation, to thick woods, to the lee side of a ridge. You cut pine branches, packed them against the wind, and hoped you curled up with your horse if you had one. If not, you curled up with your rifle and didn't sleep. They called it riding out the blow. Some didn't set, and yet, every spring, new trappers came. Some young and eager, some old and scarred. They followed the same trails, camped by the same frozen creeks, and left behind the same stories scratched into trees or carved into rock. There was no glamour in it, no romance, just grit, cold grit, the kind that kept you alive one more night in the snow, with only your fire, your rifle, and whatever part of your brain refused to quit. At 10,000 feet, fire wasn't just comfort, it was your heartbeat. You could be starving, soaked to the skin, lost in a whiteout. But if you could get a fire going, you had a shot. Without it, you were on a timer. And the mountains didn't hand out second chances. The trick wasn't starting a fire. The trick was starting it in snow. Most trappers learned the hard way. Snow eats fire. Lay your bundle of sticks straight on the snow, and the whole thing sinks hissing and steaming into the white, gone. It had to be elevated, on bark or a thick log base, pine boughs, if you had nothing else, anything to lift it off the cold. Then came the tinder. Birch bark was gold, dry pine needles, cattail fluff, old man's beard moss. All were useful if you knew where to find them. But in winter, everything was wet. Even standing trees sweated moisture when split. So trappers carried their own kindling kits, flint and steel, a grease-soaked cloth, curls of wood shaved into feather sticks. Some even tucked tinder into their shirts to keep it dry with body heat. Matches were rare. When they existed, they were fragile and unreliable. A good trapper didn't rely on them. He used steel and stone, and he practiced, in wind, in snow, with stiff fingers. One strike, one spark. That's all you got sometimes. If you were lucky enough to get it going, the fire had to be fed constantly. Wet wood smoked before it caught. It had to be dried alongside the flame, rotated, flipped, coaxed. Fire wasn't a set-it-and-forget-it affair. It was babysitting in the worst weather imaginable. And the wind? That was its own kind of predator. Wind could tear the fire from your hands. So men built windbreaks, rock walls, snow berms, pine log barriers. Some dug down into the snow and built fire pits beneath the surface, the sides lined with bark to keep it from collapsing. Others packed snow hard into a wall, carved out a hollow, and lit their fires inside it, a kind of snow cave oven. Heat was precious. Trappers used it wisely, cooked meat first, if they had any, then melted snow for drinking, then dried their socks or boots. Wet boots were a death sentence. Many men kept two pairs, rotating one near the fire while wearing the other. Even if both were cold, warmth mattered less than dry. Animal fat, bear grease, elk tallow, doubled as fuel. In a pinch, a trapper could smear fat on pine cones or cloth, light it, and get a flame hot enough to catch wood. Some used coals carried from previous camps in bark bundles or metal tins. You didn't waste fire if you didn't have to. Fire also marked your presence, which wasn't always safe. Some trappers lit fires only at dusk, let them burn low, then doused them before sleeping. The glow could attract attention from other men, from hostile tribes, from wolves. A fire was warmth, yes, but it was also a signal. That choice, to light or not to light, was a nightly calculation, risk versus survival. In groups, men could take turns keeping watch, rotating fire duty, managing smoke. Alone, it was different. You didn't sleep deeply, you curled close, using your saddle as a pillow, your rifle as a companion, and your ears tuned to every crack of branch or shift of wind. Sometimes, in the high passes, even fire gave out. There were stories of men stranded in whiteouts who burned everything, their spare shirts, their saddlebags, even their snowshoes. One trapper, legend said, boiled his own beaver pelts for calories and used the soaked fur to insulate his boots. Another made a fire by striking steel on frozen quartz after running out of flint. It took him 3 hours. He survived. The men who made it through those winters didn't talk much about it later, not because they forgot, but because words didn't do it justice. They remembered the smell of burning pine, the hiss of snow melting near the flames, the sting of smoke in wind-chapped eyes. They remembered the moment when cold fingers stopped shaking because the fire finally took. And they remembered this when you were out there alone above the tree line. Fire wasn't warmth, fire was life, and life had to be earned, one spark at a time. Most trappers weren't truly alone, not for long anyway. Behind every solitary man in a snowdrift with a beaver pelt and frostbitten fingers was a vast, grinding trade machine. Fur companies, shipping outfits, frontier merchants, and investors thousands of miles away who never felt the cold. Names like the American Fur Company, Hudson's Bay Company, Rocky Mountain Fur Company. These were the engines that drove the trade, and their profits depended on one thing, a steady supply of pelts, even in winter. That meant winter trapping wasn't optional. It was expected. Company men, salaried trappers under contract, were often stationed at remote trading posts. These weren't bustling towns. Think log huts along a frozen river, half buried in snow, manned by a handful of men, and maybe a native interpreter. Posts like Fort Benton, Fort Laramie, Fort Astoria, places where the wind never stopped blowing. Trade was a delicate dance. Trappers brought in beaver, otter, fox, muskrat, sometimes mink or marten. They received in return powder, lead, salt, flour, blankets, tobacco, needles, steel traps. But not all trade was with the company. Much of it came through native tribes who were far more skilled at winter survival and had been trapping long before Europeans ever showed up. Without native knowledge, many trappers would have frozen by the first snowfall. Tribes taught them how to track animals under snow, how to build insulated shelters, how to store meat underground. In return, the companies offered trade goods, rifles, kettles, beads, whiskey. It was a cycle that fed itself. But then came winter, real winter, and everything slowed. Supply lines vanished under snow. Wagon trains couldn't make it through mountain passes. Rivers froze, halting canoe travel. Messages between posts took weeks, if they arrived at all. Sometimes a trapper out in the wild had no contact for months. He might fill his packs with pelts, cache them in trees or caves, and wait for spring, or try to snowshoe his way to a post with the load on his back. Most posts stayed open through winter, but they were skeleton crews. The men chopped wood, mended gear, smoked meat, boiled coffee that tasted like old pine needles. They trapped when they could. They bartered with passing hunters. They played cards by candlelight and read the same letter from home 50 times. The ledgers still got filled out. The company always tracked weight. A beaver pelt was made when it was stretched, dried, and ready for shipment. They were counted in stacks, pressed into bundles, marked by quality. Fine winter pelts brought the highest prices, which is why men risked everything to get them. There were years when deep snow delayed spring rendezvous by months. Rendezvous were the heart of the mountain fur trade. Massive summer meetups where trappers, traders, and native tribes gathered to sell furs, restock supplies, and occasionally drink themselves half to death. Miss a rendezvous, and your year's work sat unsold. That could mean hunger next winter, or worse. If your credit ran dry with the company, you might not be given any powder or food at all. Your name would be struck from the books. You'd become effectively disposable. That's why some trappers risked avalanche routes and frozen rivers in March, not because they were reckless, but because they couldn't afford not to. Still, the companies didn't carry these men. If a trapper died in the snow, the company wrote it off. The loss was calculated into the books. The pelt totals mattered, not the fingers that froze catching them. A few trappers broke away entirely. They traded independently, bartered directly with tribes, lived year-round in remote valleys, and ignored the big posts. These men, the free trappers, were both admired and pitied. They answered to no one, but if things went wrong, no one came looking. Winter made that truth very clear. By the 1840s, the fur trade began to fade. Silk replaced beaver in hats. Eastern fashion changed. But the stories didn't stop. The names lived on. So did the places. And every so often, Someone hiking through a snowy pass would stumble across a rusted steel trap in the rocks, or a bone-handled knife half buried in pine needles. A piece of that world left behind, of a time when winter ruled everything, and survival meant not just braving the cold, but understanding how to live with it, step by step, pelt by pelt, fire by fire. Mail, mules, and midnight riders. Winter on the overland stagecoach. There were two things you could count on in the West. The weather was going to turn, and the mail was going to ride anyway. By the 1860s, the Overland Stage Company was the beating heart of long-distance travel in the American West. Long before the railroads stitched the country together, coaches pulled by teams of mules or horses ran mail and passengers along wild, often barely passable roads. From Missouri to California, from Salt Lake City to Denver, across plains, rivers, deserts, and mountains. And when winter hit, the job didn't stop. Every route had its own flavor of misery. Some stations were buried in snow by November. Some sat in windswept passes where the drifts could swallow a man whole. But the schedule was the schedule. The stage left when it was supposed to. The mail bags were loaded. The reins snapped, and off they went, into the cold, the dark, and the unknown. A typical coach carried 6 to 9 passengers inside, with maybe 1 or 2 clinging to the top. Add a couple 100 pounds of mail, some freight, and supplies, and you had a rolling target for every storm and obstacle between stations. And it wasn't just the elements. There were bandits, swollen rivers, axle breaks, and wolves. But in winter, none of those compared to the snow. The cold wasn't just a discomfort. It was a logistical nightmare. Axles froze. Grease turned to sludge. Harnesses snapped. Drivers called jehus. Lost fingers to frostbite while trying to tie down loose tarps. The wheels didn't always roll over snow. Sometimes they had to be dug out every mile. Passengers paid for the privilege. A ride from St. Louis to San Francisco could take 25 days. In winter, double that. If you were lucky, you sat packed in beside strangers, knees touching, breath fogging the windows, wrapped in whatever furs or quilts you brought with you. There was no heat, just body warmth and hope. When the wind got bad, everyone leaned forward and prayed the coach wouldn't tip. At night, the real challenge began. The coaches didn't stop. They ran through the dark. The only light came from the stars, or the weak glow of a lantern swinging from the driver's perch. Inside, passengers tried to sleep as the wheels jounced and creaked. Outside, the driver battled drifting snow and ice, watching for the glint of the next station, a dot of firelight in an endless black world. The stations were life-saving oases. Every 10 to 15 miles, if things were going right, you'd reach one, a log hut, a small cabin, maybe a barn with a stove and a stable. Station keepers lived out there for months, sometimes alone, sometimes with family. Their job: feed the next team, warm the riders, get them back on the road. Some stations were well stocked. Others were barely more than a lean-to with a pile of wood and a kettle of weak coffee. But any station was a miracle in a storm. If the horses died, they'd use mules. If the mules died, they might hitch up oxen. If those died, well, you started walking. That happened more than people like to admit. And still the mail kept going. That was the thing. Even when passengers turned back, Even when the freight was dumped to lighten the load, the mail pouches stayed. They were government property. Tampering with them was a federal offense. Drivers sometimes died with the bags still slung over their shoulders. There are stories, many true, of riders caught in blizzards who stripped the pouches from the dead, threw them over their back, and kept going on foot. The motto wasn't cessed official, not yet, but it was already lived. Neither snow nor rain nor gloom of night. And it wasn't just letters. Newspapers, bank drafts, army orders, marriage proposals, death notices, all moving west, wrapped in canvas, and buried under snow because someone believed the message mattered more than the weather. The West wasn't built on comfort. It was built on movement. And winter, no matter how brutal, couldn't stop that coach from trying to make the next bend. There was a sound to winter on the stage line, the sharp groan of leather stretched over frozen harness, the clatter of iron wheels over rutted, ice-bound road, the driver's muffled curses, half-spoken through a scarf drawn tight across his face. But mostly there was wind, not just cold, cutting. It didn't push. It sliced. It peeled heat from your hands and face, numbed your feet before you noticed, and turned every gust into a challenge. Keep going, or be buried. Stagecoach drivers knew the routine. At every stop, they checked the axles. The grease would freeze solid. When it did, the wheels locked up, and you had to build a fire under the coach just to get things moving again. It wasn't safe. Sparks flew, tar ignited, but if you didn't do it, the coach wasn't going anywhere. A fire under the axle was better than frostbite in a stalled rig. Wood was scarce. Most drivers carried emergency bundles beneath the coach, bundles of split pine or dry sagebrush, wrapped in oiled canvas to keep the snow off. Some burned fence posts or tore wood from abandoned homesteads. In an emergency, they broke down parts of the coach itself. You burned what you had to. The horses suffered too. Blankets helped. But in a full blizzard, even strong draft teams began to stumble, their nostrils iced over. Snow crusted their lashes. More than one coach limped into a station with horses nearly dead on their feet. When that happened, you unhitched them, rubbed them down with burlap, maybe fed them hot mash, if the station had it. Sometimes, though, you just let them go. Unhitch them, give them a slap, and hope they found shelter on their own. If the coach broke down for good, the protocol was grim. Build a fire, gather the passengers, and wait. If no one came within 48 hours, you walked. But walking in snowdrifts wasn't a real solution. It was a gamble, especially at night. So the driver watched the sky, listened to the wind, and counted the hours. Inside the coach, things weren't much better. It was cramped, dark, and loud. The windows froze over. Moisture from breath turned to ice along the wood. Passengers layered everything they owned. Shawls, buffalo robes, scarves, feet wrapped in newspapers or old rags, hands stuck in pockets, knees pressed together for warmth. There was no privacy. If you had to relieve yourself, you did it fast when the coach stopped, usually behind a snowbank, while the driver yelled at you to hurry. The worst part was the waiting. Not knowing if the next station was still standing. Not knowing if the snow would cave in the roof. Not knowing if the river up ahead had frozen solid or was waiting to crack beneath the wheels. Some passengers refused to leave the coach, even when it was safer to do so. Others jumped off and ran ahead, trying to reach a station on foot. A few didn't make it. Their bodies were found weeks later, curled behind rocks or trees, hands still gripping the last mail pouch they tried to carry with them. The stagecoach wasn't a luxury ride. It was a moving survival test. At night, fires became everything. Drivers built them beside the road when storms trapped them. At stations, keepers kept one going around the clock, fueled by buffalo chips, dry brush, and anything they could chop down with frozen hands. Passengers crowded around these fires, strangers one moment, survival companions the next. They shared biscuits, jerked meat, whatever someone had left. They passed flasks, told stories, or sat in silence, watching the flames reflect in their frostbitten faces. Sometimes the coach arrived hours late, sometimes days, and occasionally not at all. But when it rolled into a way station at midnight, lamps swinging, horses snorting steam, snow falling off the roof like dust, it was a miracle. Every time, people cheered, men wept, and inside those battered canvas mailbags were letters that meant the world to someone. Because out there, a letter wasn't just a message, it was connection. It was proof that someone cared whether you were still alive. And every wheel that turned, every frozen rein pulled tight, every mile pushed forward through the dark was a small act of faith, the kind that lit fires in the worst storms. They didn't ride the stagecoach. They didn't carry rifles or steer mules through snowdrifts. But without them, the whole thing collapsed. The station keepers were the invisible spine of the overland stage route, the quiet men and women posted every 10 to 20 miles along thousands of miles of prairie, desert, and mountains. Their job was simple: keep the fire burning, the team ready, and the coffee hot. In winter, that job became survival. Each station varied. Some were rough-hewn log cabins. Others were fortified adobe posts with a bunkhouse, stable, and well. Some were just shacks slapped together with whatever wood was lying around. But all had one thing in common: isolation. Most stations were manned by a single person, sometimes two, occasionally a whole family. And once the snow came, they weren't going anywhere. Food had to be stockpiled by October. That meant barrels of flour, sacks of dried beans, salt pork, coffee, maybe some dried apples or onions. If they had livestock, they had to slaughter early and smoke the meat. If they had no animals, they relied entirely on the company's resupply, which didn't always make it. One missed wagon train, and you were rationing by Christmas. Water had to be melted from snow. Wood had to be chopped daily. If the wind blew hard enough, it erased the trail entirely. You'd walk outside and see nothing, just white in every direction. But when the stage came, you had to be ready. That meant a fresh team of horses or mules, fed, harnessed, and warmed. The coach had maybe 5 minutes to stop, switch teams, unload a sack or two of mail or cargo, let passengers stretch their legs or relieve themselves, and then it was gone. 5 minutes, sometimes in a blizzard. The keeper didn't complain. He nodded to the driver, took the spent team into the barn, fed and watered them, then went back inside. Maybe the coach brought news, a letter, a newspaper from back east. Maybe not. And then it was quiet again. If you were lucky, you had a dog. If you were luckier, you had a wife or a partner. Some women ran stations themselves. Tough, capable women who shot wolves off the roof, cooked meals over smoky fires, and nursed passengers through fevers when the coach dumped someone half dead at their door. Children at stations grew up fast. They learned to patch saddles, rub down mules, reload guns, and track storms by watching the clouds. School wasn't an option. The world was the lesson. When a blizzard shut everything down, the station became a lifeboat. If a coach couldn't make it to the next stop, everyone on board stayed. That meant a house built for 3 might sleep 10. Beds were shared. Floors were crowded. Every scrap of food was stretched. The stove ran all night. No one slept much, but no one froze either. And when spring finally came, the thaw wasn't fast or clean. It was muddy, slow, and dangerous. Floods took out bridges. Horses broke legs in sinkholes, but the keepers stayed. Year after year, season after season. Most didn't get rich. Their pay was meager, food expensive. Life was dull, hard, and often thankless. But many kept at it for decades. Why? Some couldn't say. Some liked the silence. Some liked the purpose. Some had nowhere else to go. And some, maybe, just believed the job mattered. Because it did. Every letter delivered. Every passenger kept alive. Every hot cup of coffee handed to a frostbitten driver. It all added up to something. A lifeline through the worst of winter. A thread that connected people across thousands of miles. The rider might have vanished into the snow. The coach might have broken down. But if the station light was still glowing in the night, someone still there, tending the fire, holding the door open, then the mail would go through. And the West would keep moving forward, one frozen wheel at a time. Mining camps and mountain snow, winter in the boomtowns. Gold didn't care about the seasons. Neither did silver or copper or quartz, which meant the men chasing it didn't stop when the snow came. They just dug deeper. By the 1860s and 70s, mining towns were sprouting up like mushrooms across the American West. Colorado, Montana, Idaho, California, Sierra Nevada. Wherever someone struck a vein, the tents followed, then the shanties, then the saloons. Whole towns seemed to appear overnight. But winter didn't care how fast you built. Boom towns like Leadville, Deadwood, and Virginia City sat at high elevations, some above 8,000 feet. That meant long winters, heavy snow, and a kind of cold that got into your lungs and stayed there. Some of these towns got 200 inches of snow or more. Roofs collapsed, trails vanished, people froze a few yards from their own doorsteps. Yet the digging never stopped. Miners worked underground, and in a way that helped. The deeper shafts were actually warmer than the surface, insulated by the earth. But getting to and from the mine was another story. You left before dawn, boots crunching over frozen mud, lanterns swinging. If a blizzard blew in, there was no guarantee you'd find your way back. Mines didn't close for snow. They closed when the dynamite ran out, or when the pump failed, or when the last mule dropped dead in the shaft. Above ground, the towns kept running, barely. The streets were chaos. Snow turned to slush. then to frozen ruts, then to icy traps that cracked wagon wheels and twisted ankles. Horses slipped. So did people. Boardwalks, when they existed, were slick with ice. When they didn't, you waded through knee-deep muck or packed snow. Shanties leaked. Chimneys smoked backward. Roofs sagged under the weight of ice. Everyone nailed extra boards over their windows and stuffed rags in the gaps. Soot-blackened snow blew in under the doors. Still, you were lucky if you had 4 walls, and luckier if they held through the season. Fuel was a problem. Woodcutters couldn't always reach the town. You burned what you could: scrap lumber, broken crates, bits of furniture. Some saloons kept their stoves going with coal if they could afford it, but most relied on pine. The air in winter reeked of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and smoke from 1,000 small fires. Then there was food. Fresh vegetables were a memory. Meat was salted or canned. Bread came from flour, shipped in months earlier if the general store had any left. When the passes closed and supply wagons stopped, prices skyrocketed. A single egg could go for $1, butter for $5. Whiskey stayed cheap, or at least cheaper than water that had to be melted and boiled. People drank to stay warm, to kill the taste of the food, or to forget how long the season stretched. And yet, somehow, life continued. Children played in the alleys, bundled in whatever rags could be tied around their arms and legs. Women shared cooking scraps. Men sharpened tools, patched boots, and argued politics in the post office or the back of the saloon. When someone died, and they always did, there was no burial until spring. The ground was too hard. The body stayed in a coffin in the back room, covered in blankets, visited once in a while by a friend with a bottle. No one liked to talk about that. Entertainment helped. If the theater was open, you went. If the brothel had a singer that night, you listened. If the saloon had a card game, you sat in. Anything to forget the cold, anything to make the night go faster. The sound of a piano, out of tune and half frozen, echoing through the snowy streets, that was gold in its own way. And when a shipment finally made it through, flour, coffee, tobacco, letters from the east, the whole town came out, a sled pulled by oxen, a half-starved driver wrapped in furs, mail bags, sacks of dried beans, a barrel of salted pork. It wasn't sick Christmas. It was survival. And it meant the outside world hadn't forgotten them. Not yet. If winter above ground was miserable, underground was something else entirely. The shafts of 19th century mining operations didn't stop for snow. Cold weather didn't freeze ambition or desperation. If anything, winter made men dig harder. They needed the pay. They needed the heat. And sometimes they just needed to be somewhere else, anywhere else than in a freezing shack above. The temperature underground stayed steadier than outside. 40 or 50 feet down, you were below the worst of the wind, below the frost, below the storms, but that didn't mean you were safe. In some ways, it meant you were trapped. Ventilation shafts were supposed to keep the air moving. In winter, they often clogged with ice or collapsed with snow. That meant fires for light, candles, lanterns, carbide lamps, quickly turned mines into smoke-choked tombs if the air wasn't moving fast enough. And then there was water. Spring melt flooded mines every year, but in winter, the seepage didn't stop. It just turned to ice. Water trickled down the walls, froze on the floor, coated ladders and timbers in a slick film that took down even the most careful boot. Picks slipped, fingers went numb, and if you broke an ankle down there, it was a long, slow haul back up the shaft, if there was anyone to haul you. Mules didn't do well in the cold either. Many mines used them to haul ore carts. They lived underground for months at a time, easier than moving them in and out, but the air, the cold, and the noise took a toll. There were miners who said they'd seen smarter looks in a mule's eyes than most of the men they worked with, and maybe they weren't joking. Timbering was critical. Shafts needed support. Winter brought moisture. Moisture froze, and when it thawed, the timbers expanded and cracked. Whole ceilings gave way. Caves-ins weren't rare, especially when men were overworked. Corners were cut, or someone used dynamite too close to a weak support. Some days you could hear the mine groan above you. That wasn't a metaphor. Miners carried their own candles, their own knives, their own flasks, a little whiskey to brace against the chill, a little chewing tobacco to help pass the hours. You worked by hand, mostly, swinging a pick, pushing a cart, watching the drips come down from the ceiling in a rhythm you started to memorize. Some brought charms, a coin from back east, a ribbon from a sweetheart, a little pocket Bible, because you never knew when a mine would collapse or when a pocket of gas would spark from a stray lantern. The deaths didn't always come in explosions. Sometimes they came in silence, a breath you didn't get to take. And when they happened in winter, it could take days to dig the bodies out. The ground above might be frozen solid, or too unstable from snow weight to risk another collapse. Funerals, if you could call them that, were short. A few words, a closed coffin, a promise to send a letter back east. If the man had family, if not, you buried him under a number. The wages didn't stop for weather. Companies expected output. If the men didn't produce ore, they didn't get paid, so they went in every day, even sick, even coughing up soot, even with fingers raw from the cold and knees cracking on the ladders. Some wore scarves soaked in vinegar, tied across their faces. Some wore lucky shirts, patched and repatched until they were more whole than cloth. Most wore boots lined with anything they could find, paper, fur, straw, and still they went down every morning, because above ground the town was starving, and below at least there was the promise of something worth digging for. Even if the gold never came, even if all that waited at the bottom of the shaft was more darkness, more sweat, and more hours spent praying the rocks held. Winter never ended with a clean break in the mountains. It dragged, it teased, a warm afternoon, then another blizzard, roads that melted just enough to become swamps. Icicles as long as a man's leg, still hanging from roofs in May. But eventually, the thaw came, and when it did, the whole town changed overnight. The snow turned to slush, then to mud, then to rivers. Boardwalks collapsed into the streets. Privies overflowed. Ice cracked off the roofs like thunder. The ground, frozen solid for 5 months, heaved and split. Boots sank to the ankles in what used to be solid trail. And then came the water underground. Mines that had been barely damp all winter started to flood fast. Seepage turned to streams. Shafts filled chest deep in a day. Pumps broke down. Buckets came up full of ice-cold water instead of ore. Support beams, swollen with melt, began to give. You could smell it coming. Damp rot, mud, the faint coppery scent of rusting rails. Miners moved fast when the thaw hit. They knew the signs. When the walls started weeping, when the ceiling dripped more than usual, when your boots squelched on a level that used to be dry, it was time to get out. Not everyone made it. Some were caught too deep. Some stayed behind to gather tools or one last cart of ore. Some were simply too slow. Floods moved fast through those tunnels. A single collapse could trap 10 men. Above ground, the town took stock. Winter graves were dug at last. Coffins hauled out from behind storerooms, from basements, from under floorboards. Some families held services, others didn't. If you'd been living beside a frozen body for 4 months, the goodbyes had already happened. The first supply wagons tried to come through. Most didn't make it. The trails were still a mess. Wheels stuck. Bridges washed out, but by late spring, some got through, bringing flour, coffee, tobacco, boots, paper. It was like gold. And then, of course, came the real gold, or silver, or whatever they were digging. The mines that survived the thaw went right back to work. Summer brought its own problems. Heat, dust, cave-ins from dry timber. But it was at least predictable, sort of. What people remembered most, though, was the climb out. Not the literal climb, though that was part of it. Up the ladders, up the icy steps hacked into the shaft walls, up past the dim lantern light toward the patch of sky that looked like freedom. No, the real climb out was mental. Miners who had spent the whole winter underground stepped into the sun squinting, blinking like animals that had forgotten the world existed. The wind on their face felt strange. The sky looked too big. They moved slow. They talked quieter. A few never really adjusted. They went back underground quickly, said they preferred it, said they slept better down there. Others walked out and never came back. Took their pay, bought a train ticket or a horse, and disappeared. And a very few, stuck around year after year, winter after winter, shaft after shaft. They became part of the mountains, part of the town, their names on the payroll books, and scratched into the beam of the mine office wall. No statue, no parade, just one more miner who knew what it meant to survive a mountain winter, to breathe dust all day and snow all night, to chase something invisible because it was the only thing worth chasing, and to walk back into the cold every fall, knowing exactly what it would take to get through it again. The first thing anyone remembered about prairie winters was the sound, or more accurately, the absence of sound except for wind. It never stopped. It came in low across the ground, dragged with it loose snow, grit, frost, and silence. You'd hear it moaning through the cracks in the walls, hissing under the door, and humming through the stovepipe like a ghost trying to get in. And the wind was only the beginning. Homesteaders came west chasing land. After the Homestead Act of 1862, the U.S. government promised 160 acres to anyone who could stick it out. 5 years, build a house, farm the land. Sounds simple. It wasn't. especially in winter. By November, the prairie changed. The grasses browned and broke. The sky flattened. What had been waving fields in summer turned to open exposure, nothing between your doorstep and 1,000 miles of Arctic cold. Snow didn't fall gently on the plains. It blew in horizontal. Drifts could bury barns, fill wells, and cover fences like they'd never existed. A storm could erase your world in hours. That's why houses mattered. Most homesteaders couldn't afford lumber. Trees were scarce. Most were dozens of miles away, so they built with what they had: earth, sod. They cut thick blocks of prairie grass, roots and all, stacked them like bricks, and packed the cracks with mud. Sod houses, or soddies, weren't pretty, but they were warm, sort of. The walls were thick and insulating, sometimes 2 feet wide, but they leaked dirt. Bugs fell from the ceiling. Water crept through in spring, and if you weren't careful, the entire back wall might collapse under the weight of a snowdrift. Still, they held heat better than a canvas tent or a thin log cabin. A good sod house with a decent stove and a careful watch could get you through. The stove was everything. Wood, again, was rare. Some families traveled miles to find it. Cottonwood, cedar, even scrap lumber if they were near the railroad. But most burned buffalo chips, dried bison dung, or cow chips if the bison were gone. It didn't smell great, but it burned hot, and it burned long. Ash was kept for lye. Nothing went to waste. On bad nights, families slept near the stove, kids on the floor, parents in rough beds stuffed with straw or grass, quilts layered thick. Everyone wore their clothes to sleep. Coats, gloves, hats. Frost crept across the inside of the windows in delicate feathers. Sometimes the water bucket froze beside the stove. Sometimes the ink froze in the inkwell. Sometimes people did too. But the real killer wasn't just cold. It was the blizzard. A true prairie blizzard came without warning. One moment, calm. The next, whiteout, snow that moved like smoke, visibility less than an arm's length. You could be standing 6 feet from your door and vanish. That's why people strung rope from the barn to the house, not for the animals, for themselves. More than one farmer froze to death within shouting distance of his front porch, found later curled up against the wall, hands raw from clawing at frozen dirt. The lucky ones stayed in, but staying in meant preparation. Every fall, families canned vegetables, salted meat, stored flour, dried apples, cleaned out the root cellar. If you didn't have 6 months of food by the first snow, you probably weren't going to make it. Water came from melted snow. Baths were rare. Laundry was rarer. And if the privy was too far to reach in a storm, you used a bucket and emptied it later. It wasn't dignified. It wasn't romantic, but it was survival. And people did it. They didn't just survive. Some even thrived. Children were born in sod houses during snowstorms. Marriages happened. Letters arrived. Life, in all its fragile, determined stubbornness, kept going. Because out there, with nothing but wind and sky and a stove glowing in the dark, the only way forward was through. And winter was just another thing to outlast. You didn't see the storm coming. That was the worst part. The sky might shift a little. The wind might change direction. But on the prairie, where there were no mountains to block your view, no forests to rustle warnings, no birds flying low to signal a shift, it all looked the same until it didn't. Then the air went white. A real blizzard didn't fall. It slammed. It moved sideways, carrying with it sharp, dry snow that scraped skin like sandpaper and stung the eyes to blindness. Within minutes, the entire world vanished. No horizon, no sky, no earth, just white, thick, roiling white. It was said you could lose your way between the house and the barn. It wasn't just a saying. More than one person did. They'd step out to check the livestock, or fetch water, or chop wood, then gone, disoriented, turned around, flailing against wind that seemed to come from all directions. A rope line between house and barn was the difference between life and death. It wasn't overkill. It was protocol. The blizzard of 1888 made that clear. They called it the School Children's Blizzard, January 12th. The morning had started warm, unusually so. Teachers let children out without their coats. Farmers went out early to work. By afternoon, the storm dropped in like a hammer. Temperatures fell fast. Winds surged. Snow thickened in seconds. Over 200 people died, many of them children caught walking home from one-room schoolhouses. Some tried to shelter in haystacks. Others curled behind fences. Some almost made it, found just yards from their doors, frozen stiff. It was a cruel reminder. The prairie didn't offer second chances. Livestock died in heaps. Chickens froze standing up. Cows wandered and disappeared. Horses buried themselves in snowdrifts, lungs freezing before the body ever had a chance to starve. That winter wasn't unique. The great die-up of 1886, 87 was another blow. That year, cattle ranchers across the plains lost over 75% of their herds. Ranches went bankrupt. Bones littered the snow when it melted. Rib cages, horns, hooves, all bleached by wind and ice. In towns, food ran out. In sod houses, people rationed flour by spoonfuls. The postal routes shut down. Trains stalled for weeks. When mail did arrive, it was soaked or frozen. News of a relative's death might reach you long after the burial. Some families didn't talk about the winters. Others talked about nothing else. How they burned corn cobs for heat. How they slaughtered their last calf. How they caught a neighbor's dog trying to get into their smokehouse. And still, there was kindness. Neighbors shared food, quilts, tools. If someone's roof collapsed, others came, even in snow, even in the dark. If a widow lost her cow, someone brought milk. If a child was born, a midwife walked 4 miles through snow to help. That sips what people forget. The winters were cruel, but the people weren't set. They knew the cost of silence. They knew what it meant when you didn't see smoke from a chimney or footprints in the snow. They knocked. They checked. They dug paths with shovels and homemade sleds. And when the worst was over, when the snow finally softened, when the dirt reappeared under the drifts, when the birds came back and the sky turned blue again, they rebuilt. They fixed what had broken. They planted what had died, and they got ready to do it all over again. The end of winter didn't come with a celebration. No fireworks, no parade, no defining moment. It just stopped, slowly, The wind softened. The snow lost its edge. One morning, the roof stopped creaking. Another, the first drip of water echoed in a tin pail. Then came the unmistakable sound of thaw, not loud, but constant. A hush, broken only by melting ice. And with it came the smell of dirt. After months of frozen earth, the prairie exhaled. Damp soil, rotting straw, manure, smoke. It wasn't pleasant, but it was real. And it meant one thing: you'd made it. Barely. The sod house, if it had survived, looked like it had been through a war. Walls sagged. Corners leaned. Mud peeled off in sheets. Grass sprouted from the roof. The door might be warped. The chimney cracked. The windows caked in soot and frost stain. But it was standing. First came repairs. Men cut new sod blocks to patch the walls. Women restuffed the mattresses with dry grass. Children cleared paths to the root cellar. If you had any nails left, you used them. If not, you found wire or twine or leather straps to hold the place together. Everything was a resource. An old belt became a hinge. A bent spoon turned into a window latch. Flour sacks were stitched into curtains. Tin cans were flattened and nailed over holes in the roof. There was no waste and no waiting. Spring was short, and planting had to begin almost immediately. While the men patched fences and the boys turned the soil, the women planted beans, onions, potatoes, anything hardy. Gardens were survival. You grew what you could store. Canning season would come again before you were ready for it. The water table rose. Wells had to be redug. Sometimes the cellars flooded. Boots sloshing through pickled beets and soaked sacks of oats. Mold crept in, but so did light. The sun finally returned. The sky didn't look like a ceiling anymore. And that mattered. Because winter didn't just take food and fuel. It took energy. It took joy. The thaw gave it back. Neighbors emerged, blinking like prairie dogs from their burrows. Men shook hands in muddy lanes. Women exchanged sourdough starters and swapped stories. Kids ran for the first time in months, chasing dogs, chasing each other, chasing the wind. There was no small talk. Everyone knew what everyone else had been through. You didn't ask how someone's winter went. You looked at their woodpile, their clothes, their livestock. You could see it in their eyes. Who had made it, who hadn't, who had lost something. But you didn't set dwell. You rebuilt. Spring socials returned, rough, early gatherings with fiddle music and biscuits, church services in barns, births and weddings squeezed between planting and mending. Laughter came back, shy and thin at first, but stronger with each week. People started planning again. They talked about new fences, new tools, maybe even a trip to town if the trail dried enough. Some years they ordered real windows, or glass lanterns, or fabric from catalogs that took 3 months to arrive but felt like Christmas when they did. It wasn't comfort, but it was progress. And every homesteader, deep down, knew what mattered most. The stove still worked, the roof was still up, and the prairie hadn't taken everything this time. You learned to live season by season, one eye on the weather, one hand always near the door latch, because another winter was coming. It always was. But now there were seeds in the ground, firewood stacked, a new baby sleeping in a cradle, carved from the same crate that once held flour. And somewhere out there, far beyond the fence line, a lark sang, the first real bird call in months. And that was enough to believe in the land again. Trading posts and Arctic trails, winter with the frontier trappers. The wilderness didn't end when winter arrived. In the far north and high mountain country, Montana, the Dakotas, Wyoming, even Alaska, winter came early and stayed long. Snow covered everything. Trails vanished. Rivers froze. Trees snapped in the cold, and men kept moving through it. Fur trappers, traders, and scouts were winter veterans. They had to be. Many lived months away from civilization. No telegraph. No towns. No cavalry. Just snow, woods, mountains, and traps. The business of pelts didn't stop for the cold. In fact, winter was often better. Animals like beavers, foxes, martens, and otters grew their thickest coats in the coldest months. A January pelt was worth double what you'd get in autumn, but it came at a cost. You had to stay alive long enough to collect it. Most trappers didn't live in houses. They stayed in lean-tos, crude log shacks, or canvas tents dug into snowbanks. A few built semi-permanent cabins near known beaver ponds or portage routes, but many roamed, setting traplines that stretched for miles, then circling back every few days. They traveled on snowshoes, long wooden ones, curved at the ends, lashed with rawhide. They left a webbed pattern behind them, the only sign they'd been there. Silence was their companion. That and the creak of the sled, the breath of the dogs, the whisper of the trees above. Fires were sacred. Every night, wherever they were, trappers made fire, flint and steel, if they had to. Tinder was tucked in a dry pouch inside the shirt, close to the chest. One failure could be fatal. Without fire, water couldn't be melted. Frostbite came in minutes. Spirits dropped faster. So you got the fire going no matter what. Birch bark, pine pitch, twisted grass, anything dry. Then you cooked. Food was simple. Salt pork, flour biscuits, dried beans if you had time, stew if you were lucky and caught snowshoe hare or squirrel. Some men lived on pemmican, a mix of fat, dried meat, and berries. High calorie, long shelf life, hard on the teeth. You boiled snow for water, melted ice, and always kept something hot in the tin cup. Tea, coffee, or even just broth made from boiled bones. You slept with your knife nearby, sometimes your rifle too. Wolves didn't often attack humans, but they followed trap lines, hoping for scraps. Bears hibernated, mostly, but if they were hungry enough, they could show up when you least expected. Some trappers swore they heard voices out there, laughter in the trees, whispering wind that didn't sound natural, whether it was just the cold playing tricks or something older. They never said for sure. They just added more wood to the fire and turned their backs to the dark. Mornings were brutal. Everything froze. Boots, laces, beards. If you left your mittens too close to the door, they'd be stiff as bark by dawn. You'd have to thaw them over steam or a candle. More than one trapper started the day barefoot, rewarming his boots by fire while standing in socks on pine needles. Then came the trap line. You walked miles, checked each trap, reset it, skinned the catch right there in the snow, rolled the pelts, salted them, and packed them in the sled. The smell of blood froze in the air. Your fingers went numb, but you kept going. Because if you didn't, there was no payday in spring. No trade at the post, no tobacco, no flour, no new boots, and maybe no you. The trapper's winter didn't end in the woods. It ended at the post. Trading posts were lifelines, not just for supplies, but for connection. Scattered across the frontier, often built near rivers or known trails, these wooden outposts were where raw wilderness met raw commerce. They weren't set fancy. Most were little more than stockaded cabins with a low roof, one or two outbuildings, a handful of bunks, and a single stove struggling to keep the frost off the walls. Inside, everything smelled like tobacco, wood smoke, grease, and damp wool. But for a man who'd been alone in the forest for 3 months, it smelled like civilization. Some posts were run by private traders. Others were part of larger networks like the Hudson's Bay Company or the American Fur Company. A few were indigenous run, especially among the Métis Cree and Ojibwe, who had their own supply chains and knew the land better than anyone. No matter who ran it, the system was simple. You brought your furs, beaver, fox, mink, muskrat, otter, and laid them out. The clerk inspected them, counted them, checked for damage. Then you were given credit, not cash, usually, but barter value. From that tally, you could draw supplies: flour, coffee, tea, tobacco, traps, powder, shot, blankets, needles, thread, boots, whiskey, if it was legal, sugar, if it wasn't too dear. Prices were high, always had been. A pound of flour might cost a day's work in pelts. A single tin of black powder could take a full otter, but you paid it because out in the woods you needed it more than you needed fairness. Some posts offered letters, old, water-stained, months late, but still, a letter from back east, from a brother, a wife, a mother, could break a man or keep him going another season. News, too, traveled through these posts. Who died, who married, where the next gold strike might be, whether a war had started or ended, whether the treaty held, whether the rail line was coming. It wasn't just supplies that passed through the post. It was the threadbare fabric of a scattered society. And it wasn't always quiet. Come winter, a post might host 20, even 30 men, trappers, traders, freighters, Métis guides, native families, sometimes all at once. It could get loud, smelly, tense. Fights broke out over prices, over women, over stolen pelts. Knives flashed. A shot might be fired. Then silence. Then someone dragged the wounded man outside, while the others went back to their cups. But more often, things held. Men played cards, smoked pipes, told stories, compared frostbite scars, shared stew out of a communal pot, while the wind slammed against the log walls like it wanted in. A dog might curl by the fire, snow might drip from the rafters, a fiddle might come out, and for one night, maybe two, the frontier didn't feel so empty. Then it was back to business. Pelts bundled, sleds reloaded, credit notes tallied and signed with a mark or a half-legible name. Some men left with more gear than they brought. Some left with almost nothing, but all of them left because spring was coming and the rivers would thaw and the beaver would move again. And no one wanted to miss the next catch. Trading posts weren't homes. They weren't warm. Not really. But they were proof you still existed. That your effort meant something. That your hands, chapped and cracked and blackened by the cold, still had value. Even if no one remembered your name. Leaving the post didn't mean the journey was over. It meant it was just beginning again. With new gear, new weight on the sled, and one long route back through half-frozen wilderness. Winter didn't retreat overnight. In the far north, March still meant deep snow, gray skies, and rivers that looked solid until they weren't. Thin ice was everywhere. It cracked under sleds. It groaned under snowshoes. One wrong step could send a trapper and his gear into black, frigid water, the kind that punched the breath out of you, seized your muscles, and turned your clothes into anchors. Most men who went through the ice didn't drown. They froze, soaked, miles from fire, unable to strip fast enough or move fast enough. If you were lucky, your dog team dragged you out. If you weren't, they circled back to the post without you. That was one reason many trappers traveled in pairs during the melt. Not for company. Most didn't talk much anyway. But for recovery, a rope, a hand, a fire already going by the time you staggered out of the river. The thaw brought other problems too. Snow turned to slush. Sleds bogged down. Trails disappeared under puddles and melting drifts. Firewood was wet. Fires smoked. Socks stayed damp for days. Boots grew mold, and everything stank of wet dog wool, musk, and rot. Animals came out, thin and hungry. Bears stirred. Wolves prowled in lean packs, watching. Even a moose could be dangerous if surprised in deep snow. But the men kept walking, because they had to. The final push, from the post back to the cabin, from the mountains back to the settlement, from one river to another, was a silent, often brutal journey. The reward wasn't gold or glory. It was rest, and not even much of that. Back at the cabin, if you had one, the roof needed patching, traps needed mending, fur needed drying and stretching. If you had a partner or a wife, she'd have a list waiting. If you didn't, you did it all yourself. Some men never made it back. A collapsed snow bridge, a misstep on the ice, a fever in the lungs that took hold and never let go. Their names weren't sit recorded. Their stories didn't sit make it into books. But sometimes a note would arrive at the post, months later, scribbled on birch bark or scrawled in charcoal on a scrap of hide. Snow, too deep. Going north. Cache, left, near Crooked Pine. If I don't sit return, trade the rifle. Others did return, gaunt, sunburned, half frostbitten, dragging furs behind them, and stashing meat in the rafters. They never called it heroic. They never talked about it much at all. But they knew what they sit done. They'd walked through a frozen world, alone or nearly so, with nothing but skill, instinct, and the stubborn will to keep going. They had survived a landscape that didn't care if they lived or died. And they'd done it again and again, year after year, until the body gave out or the trade dried up or the wilderness finally took them. Their stories didn't need to be loud. The silence had said enough. Frontier doctors and snowbound medicine. Healing in the cold. The knock always came late, middle of the night. Wind screaming outside. A horse pawing at the snow. A boy on the porch, breath steaming, eyes wide, stammering something about his mother or his sister, or a neighbor coughing blood. The doctor grabbed his bag. No questions. No sleep, just layers of wool, a heavy coat, and a saddle already half frozen. Because out there, somewhere across miles of white, someone was dying. Frontier medicine wasn't science. It was courage, luck, and a race against time. The West had few doctors, fewer nurses. One physician might serve an entire county, hundreds of square miles. And in winter, that meant travel, long, brutal travel. Some rode horses, others used sleighs. A few went on snowshoes or skis, strapping their bags to their backs and praying the wind held off long enough to reach the patient before it was too late. They rode through blizzards. They crossed frozen rivers. Hearing the ice crack underfoot, they got lost. They froze, but they kept going because they had to. A woman in labor couldn't wait. A boy with a fever couldn't wait. A man crushed by a log. A girl who fell through the ice. These weren't injuries that could be put off until spring. And the places they arrived at weren't hospitals. They were sod, houses, shacks, tents. No heat, no lights, no sterile rooms. The patient lay on a straw bed under patchwork quilts. A single oil lamp flickered. Family huddled around, silent, watching every move, hoping. The doctor unpacked his tools. Forceps, scalpel, needles, thread, bottles of morphine, quinine, carbolic acid, a saw wrapped in cloth, clean if they were lucky, still sharp if they were luckier. Gloves were rare, anesthetics rarer. Most surgeries were fast and raw. You bit down on leather or wood. You gripped the edge of the bed. You screamed. Then it was over, or it wasn't sit. A broken leg might be splinted. A dislocated shoulder popped back in. A bullet wound stitched, burned, bandaged. But infection, that was the real killer, especially in winter. There was no way to boil water in a blizzard, no way to clean a wound, when the only liquid you had was frozen in its bottle. A splinter of wood, a missed shard of bone, a careless hand, and the rot would start. Fever followed. Sometimes the doctor stayed, sat by the bed, listened to the breathing, slow and ragged, changed dressings, spoon-fed broth. Sometimes they couldn't stay. They had to ride on to the next call, and the family was left alone, watching the sweat bead and the skin flush red. If the fever broke, you lived. If it didn't, the blankets were wrapped tighter. The window was cracked just a little, and by morning, the body was cold. Still, they tried. Midwives delivered babies in the dark, hands raw from scrubbing with melted snow. Healers brewed teas from roots they'd gathered in summer. Some used indigenous medicine, sage, willow bark, bear grease, cedar smoke. Not all doctors had formal training. Many learned on the job. Some had read 2 medical books, passed through a city for a year and found themselves the only doctor in 300 miles. But they learned fast. Because out here, learning fast was the only option. And when the night was quiet and no knock came, the doctor patched his boots, sharpened his knife, refilled the vials, and waited. Because the next storm was always coming. And someone somewhere would need help. If you broke your leg in winter and it didn't set right, you limped forever. If it turned black, swollen, or sour smelling, you prayed someone could take it off in time. And if they couldn't sit, you died. Amputations on the frontier weren't rare. They were the brutal truth behind frostbite, gunshot wounds, crushed limbs, and infections that spread too fast to stop. The cold could preserve a body part just long enough to fool you until the black rot started crawling up the leg, or the fever set in, or the skin split and drained pus. And then it had to come off. There was no clean operating table, no sterile mask, just a wooden bench or a kitchen table cleared of food and covered in a quilt. Lanterns hung from the rafters or held by a trembling hand. The patient drank whiskey or bit a stick, maybe both. The doctor tightened the tourniquet, tested the bone with his fingers, then reached into the bag and pulled out the saw. It wasn't sit pretty. It wasn't sit quiet. The sound of bone being cut, the way it echoed in a frozen room, stayed with people for life. Speed mattered more than finesse. A good frontier doctor could cut, saw, and stitch a leg in under 10 minutes. Any longer, and the patient might bleed out or pass out for good. Once it was off, the stump was wrapped in rags soaked in carbolic acid. If they had it, or salt water, or nothing at all. The lucky ones lived. The luckier ones healed. But not everything was blood and pain. Some days it was birth. Childbirth on the frontier was its own kind of war. Women gave birth in sod houses, log cabins, tents, wagons. They gave birth in February cold, with snow pressing at the door and frost painting the rafters above them. They labored in silence or screams, surrounded by midwives, sisters, sometimes just a neighbor, and a pile of boiled cloth. The stove was stoked high. The baby was born, slippery and red. Sometimes it cried, sometimes it didn't. The mother often didn't know until someone whispered it's here or looked away. Bleeding was the real danger. That and infection. If the doctor made it in time, they might bring forceps or laudanum or a single clean scalpel wrapped in sheepskin, but more often they arrived late, too late to stop a hemorrhage or correct a breach. A woman who survived 5 or 6 births on the prairie was considered strong. A woman who survived 10 was a legend. And many didn't set. They were buried in frozen ground with the baby, or the baby was raised by a sister or aunt. Life went on. Grief was real, but quiet. There was no time to pause. The stove still needed feeding. The cow still needed milking. Some women became healers themselves. They memorized herbs. They boiled willow bark for pain. They poulticed frostbite with warm bread. They stitched wounds and cleaned burns with homemade salve. These women weren't listed in books. They didn't wear white coats, but they saved more lives than most doctors ever could. And when someone in the family fell ill, coughing blood, shaking with fever, eyes yellow from typhoid or liver sickness. The house turned into a sick ward. Windows were cracked to let in air. Blankets piled high. Hot stones wrapped in towels were placed at the feet. A wet cloth on the head. Water spooned between cracked lips. They didn't sit, always survive. But when they did, they remembered who stayed by their side, who stirred the fire, who changed the dressings, who whispered, "Just hold on, one more night." Because sometimes that sip's all it took. One more night, and the storm would pass. On the frontier, the ground froze deep, sometimes 4 feet, sometimes more. And when someone died in winter, the question wasn't what hymn to sing, it was how to dig. Axes came out first. You had to break through the top layer like chopping stone. Then the shovels, iron ones, beaten dull with years, scraped through frostbite hard clay. It might take 6 hours. It might take all day, sometimes longer. Men worked in shifts, hands raw and breath thick. Women waited inside, boiling coffee. If there wasn't enough daylight, they lit lanterns and kept digging in the dark. When the hole was done, wide enough, deep enough, the body was brought out, wrapped in blankets, sewn shut in canvas, or laid in a crude pine box if someone had lumber to spare. There wasn't much ceremony. A prayer, maybe. A few words. Sometimes just a silence. The wind filled in the rest. In towns, they might mark the grave with a cross. Out on the prairie, a pile of stones. In the mountains, maybe a bent iron tool stuck in the soil. Names were often carved later, if at all, and the doctor would ride home alone, with the empty vial still in his bag. He had done all he could. But here sits what sits strange. Despite the cold, the odds, the isolation, most frontier doctors stayed. They didn't have to. No one would have blamed them if they left. Some did. Packed up and headed east, back to schools, clinics, warmer cities with hospitals and sterile instruments and heated halls. But others kept riding. They learned to read a fever by the eyes, to feel a pulse with frozen fingers, to tell a good cough from a bad one in the space of a breath. They remembered whose daughter had scarlet fever last spring, and who needed a new splint, and which cabin door stuck when it iced over. They weren't just doctors. They were record keepers, witnesses, anchors. And they weren't set alone. There were midwives who delivered half the county's children with no more than a boiled knife and a steady voice. There were indigenous healers whose knowledge of roots and smoke saved lives long before the doctors arrived. There were mothers who taught their daughters how to clean wounds and calm seizures with a spoon and a cloth. They didn't write it down. They didn't charge a fee. But they knew what worked. And when a blizzard came, and the roads vanished, and the horses bucked and shivered and refused to go forward, they went anyway, because someone needed them. They rode into the storm. They knocked on the door. They lit the lamp. And they stayed until the fever broke, or the baby came, or the silence told them it was over. Then they packed up, stepped outside, and kept going. Mail carriers, stage drivers, and the winter routes that never stopped. It was just a letter, a few ounces of paper, a name and a destination. But to the man hauling it through a snowstorm, hunched on a saddle, or gripping frozen reins, it was everything. On the frontier, the mail wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline. A letter meant you were still real, still connected to a world beyond the mountains or prairie or frozen trail. It meant your name still mattered to someone, and the people who carried those letters, they mattered too. Even if no one remembered their names, mail didn't stop for winter. The U.S. mail contracts were blunt, 6 days per week, rain or snow. And in places like Montana, Nebraska, Colorado, the Dakotas, Idaho, and the Yukon, that meant facing down blizzards, river crossings, and temperatures so cold the ink in your pen froze solid. The routes varied. Some were on foot, some on horseback, some by dog sled or sleigh. Others clung to rough stagecoaches thundering through high passes and across black ice. They were called snowshoe mailmen in the Rockies, mushers in Alaska and Canada, jackrabbit couriers out on the plains, and most of them traveled alone. Their gear was simple: snowshoes, blankets, a rifle, a flask of tea or whiskey, and a mail pouch they'd guard with their lives. Some carried revolvers, not for people, but wolves or desperate travelers who hadn't eaten in days. The mail was federal property. Stealing it could get you shot or jailed. Losing it was unthinkable. One mail carrier, John Snowshoe Thompson, crossed the Sierra Nevada between California and Nevada every winter for 20 years. He wore homemade skis over 10 feet long, carried a 100-pound mail sack, and made the 90-mile round trip every 10 days. Without a map, without a trail, through storms that killed seasoned mountain men. He never once lost a letter. Another man, Simeon Maillet of Idaho, delivered mail on snowshoes for 3 decades. He carried the post between mining camps, navigating canyons and avalanche slopes, with a canvas sack lashed to his back and a fur hat pulled low over his eyes. There were hundreds like them, nameless men who trudged alone through blinding snow, pulling sleds, hauling satchels, crossing frozen lakes by moonlight, their only compass the shape of the land and their own memory of it. They didn't do it for fame. They weren't trying to be heroes. They just had a job to do, and they did it, week after week, storm after storm, because they knew what those letters meant. A line from a son at war, a birth announcement, a death notice, a promise to return in spring, a single sentence scratched in pencil: "I'm still alive." Mail mattered. And sometimes they carried more than letters. They brought medicine, legal papers, telegraph updates, news from Washington or St. Louis or San Francisco. They carried the outside world on their backs through forests that hadn't seen footprints in months. When they arrived, late, early, frostbitten, soaked, it didn't matter. Someone would open the door, stare, and say, "You made it." Then came the questions. Is there a letter for me? Any news from Kansas? Did my brother write? And when the pouch opened and the names were read, and a woman's hands trembled over a folded page, or a miner grinned through cracked lips at a scrap of handwriting, that was the moment that made it worth it. The moment the long road, the cold, the silence, all of it made sense, because the letter had made it through. Stagecoach driving wasn't set a winter job. It was a war of inches. The coaches themselves were wooden boxes on wheels, high clearance, hard benches, no suspension beyond leather straps that groaned in the cold. In winter, The wheels locked up, the grease turned to stone, iron rims cracked from the freeze. But the mail had to go. If the coach couldn't roll, it got dragged on skids. If the team couldn't pull, the driver walked. If the road was impassable, they made a new one with axes, ropes, snowshoes, or pure stubbornness. Stage lines across the West, the Overland Trail, the Butterfield Line, the Montana and Idaho routes were more than mail routes. They were arteries of commerce, banking, and government. Money orders, deeds, court documents, mining claims, land patents, troop instructions, all rode beside sacks of letters and shivering passengers. Drivers weren't set soft. They wore buffalo coats, wool mittens over leather gloves, bandanas soaked in bear grease to keep frostbite off their cheeks. Some packed pistols, others rifles, not for show, but because being ambushed in a blizzard was still being ambushed. Stage robbery didn't set stop for winter. If anything, it got worse. Snow made it harder to track outlaws, easier to block roads. Saboteurs could wedge logs across trails or set up false markers that led the coach straight into a ravine. A few bad men buried themselves in snowbanks with rifles, waiting for the sound of wheels, but stage drivers were no amateurs. Many were ex-cavalry or ex-miners. All had seen death before. They knew which bends drifted deepest, which bridges held, which mountains could be crossed at night, and which ones would bury you before morning. They ran tight crews. One man drove, one handled the horses, one might ride shotgun, literally with a double-barreled 10-gauge. And when they stopped for the night, it was usually in a way station, a cabin halfway between towns, stocked with hay, hardtack, coffee, and firewood if they were lucky. If not, they camped in the coach, wrapped in horse blankets, listening to the ice crack on the river beside them. Passengers sometimes panicked. A woman might start crying when they hit the high passes. A banker might go pale when the road vanished under snow, but the driver didn't flinch. He'd spit in the snow, tap the brake and shout something to the lead horse, and the whole rig would keep crawling forward. Some routes were harder than others. The Deadwood Line ran through Dakota blizzards. The Bozeman Trail cut across Montana's frozen ridgelines. The routes into Idaho had switchbacks so narrow that one bad turn meant a 200-foot fall, and no one was coming to pull you out until spring. And still they drove. Not for glory, not even for the pay, which was pitiful. They drove because the mail had to move, because if one link broke, the whole chain snapped, and in a town buried under 6 feet of snow, that might mean no doctor, no court date, no wages, no word from home. So they lashed the lines, clicked the brake, kept the firewood dry, and watched the white horizon for signs of trouble. They weren't saints. They cursed, they drank, they gambled on Sundays. But when it came to the road, they had rules. You never left a man behind. You never skipped a pouch. And if the axle broke, you walked. Because there was always someone waiting on the other end. Someone with a letter in their hand and a hope in their chest. And it was your job to get it to them. When the snow started to melt, the roads didn't get easier. They got worse. Ruts turned to rivers. Ice turned to sludge. Bridges collapsed under their own weight. Coaches sank to their axles. Horses balked at the mud. and every stream swelled to twice its size, cold and fast, and full of last year's bones. But still, the mail came. The last mile was often the slowest, uphill, through melting drifts, over frozen puddles that cracked like glass. Sometimes a rider had to finish on foot, hauling the bag across fence lines and slush-covered fields to reach the final ranch, the last town, the only cabin for 10 miles in any direction. They never rang the bell, just knocked, or handed it over in silence, a nod, a wordless acknowledgement between people who knew winter's weight. Some carriers left without waiting. Others stayed for coffee, warmed their hands, maybe read the envelope aloud if the recipient couldn't see anymore. And when they walked away, they disappeared down the same track they'd come in on, one set of prints already filling with melting snow. Most didn't expect thanks. They weren't famous. Their names weren't carved in monuments or taught in school books, but some made it into local memory. A mountain trail in Colorado called Snowshoe Pass, a stone cabin in Montana, with U.S. Mail 1889 scratched into the hearth, a tattered sled on display in an Alaskan roadhouse with a faded plaque, "Charlie brought the last mail through in the blizzard of Phi 98. Some families kept the letters. The paper had yellowed. The ink had bled, but it still sat in a drawer, wrapped in twine, beside a tintype photo or a pressed flower, because it was real. It had made it. And that meant the person who wrote it was real, too. Others remembered the men themselves. Not by their full names, just the mailman, that tall one with the black dog, the stage driver who wouldn't stop singing through a storm. And in a few rare cases, a child followed in their footsteps, literally, carried the bag, took over the route, learned the turns, the markers, the river crossings, how to read the snow for signs of wolves, how to read the people for what they weren't saying out loud, because what they carried wasn't just mail. It was news, hope, closure, connection, the bridge between two cold rooms, two quiet towns, two people wondering if the other still remembered. And when the trains came, the jobs changed. Stagecoaches faded, dog sleds retired, routes shortened, trails vanished under steel and timber and telegraph poles. The frontier shrank, but the silence didn't set. And even today, somewhere in the backcountry, there are old mailbags rotting in a collapsed barn, rusted sleigh runners tangled in alder, a set of initials carved into the bark of a tree no one's looked at in 100 years. Proof that someone passed this way, in winter, against the odds, for reasons no one else would have risked, just to carry a letter. Frozen trails, and the women who wouldn't stay home. Winter didn't care who you were. Whether you wore a bonnet or a buffalo coat, if you were out in it, the cold bit just the same. And some women didn't wait for anyone to do the hard things for them. They stepped outside, saddled the horse, pulled the sled, gripped the rifle, took the map, or made their own. They weren't supposed to. The rules, unspoken, unwritten, said a woman's place in winter was near the fire, in the cabin, boiling broth, watching the frost, climb the window, waiting. But some women ignored the rules. Some women rode out. It started quiet. A trip into town for flour because her husband was laid up with frostbite. A fence that needed mending before the elk got in. A calf born early hooves freezing to the dirt. No time to wait. Then came more. A neighbor's child, coughing blood. A snowstorm that stranded a wagon. A fire that left a widow, and 2 kids barefoot in the snow. Someone had to act, and she was already putting on her boots. In the high plains and mountain territories, survival didn't come with gender roles. It came with action. If a man was dead, or gone, or drinking himself senseless, someone else had to carry the load. That someone was often a woman, and not just once, year after year. Some were ranchers, ran the place themselves after their husband froze in a cattle drive or took a bullet in a land dispute. They rode fence lines in blizzards, shot coyotes from the porch, taught their kids to skin deer and fire a rifle before they turned 12. Some were freighters. They hauled goods between towns on sleds drawn by oxen or mules. Heavy coats, cracked hands, ice crusted in their hair. They show up at a trading post after 2 days in minus 30 degrees, hand over the ledgers, and say, "Got your beans, need more lamp oil." Others were healers, not just midwives, but bone setters, herbalists, and caretakers for entire towns. They knew how to pack a frostbitten limb in snow to stop the spread, how to brew willow bark for pain, how to keep a man breathing through pneumonia using nothing but steam and cloth. A few were outlaws. Or maybe they were just called that because they didn't ask permission. There were women who rode alone with rifles on their back, women who dressed like men because pants made it easier to chop firewood, women who cut their hair short and never explained themselves. Not everyone liked them, but when winter came and roads vanished and someone had to ride out, they were the ones who did it. Some carried mail, others messages. Some took in orphaned children from neighbors who froze in the night. Some tracked wolves to protect their livestock. Some stayed up for 48 hours straight, nursing a dying settler through fever because no one else would. And when spring came, no one handed them a medal. No newspaper wrote their names, but their kids remembered. Their neighbors remembered. The trail they carved through 6 feet of snow to deliver food that got remembered. And in some places, their names stuck to the land. A creek named after a woman who drowned, saving her horse. A cabin with initials carved into the lintel, MEB 1873. A footpath still called Annie's Cut because she used it to walk into town every week for 8 winters straight. They weren't doing it to be legends. They were doing it because someone had to, and they never waited for permission. Some winters, there simply were no men. They'd left for mining camps, gone to war, or vanished chasing cattle across the Dakotas. Some never came back. Others didn't write. A few were buried out on the trail, their graves marked with a wooden post and a hat nailed to it. That left the cabin and everything in it to the woman. She wasn't prepared, no one ever was, but she figured it out. She chopped wood until her arms went numb. She milked the cow in winds that tore the warmth from her hands before the bucket was half full. She hauled water, broke ice from the well, patched the roof, kept the fire burning, mended boots, taught her children how to trap rabbits and shoot clean. This was not the frontier romance. It was a freezing, monotonous, back-breaking routine. Days blurred into weeks. Snow piled so high, she couldn't open the front door. The smoke hole iced over. The food ran low. And still, she moved. One task, then the next. One breath, then another. The kids watched and learned. By 9 or 10, they could build a fire, dress a wound, and shoot a rifle steady in the wind. Not because anyone wanted them to grow up fast, but because they had to. If Mass slipped on the ice and couldn't get up, someone needed to fetch help. And sometimes help was a 4-hour walk through waist-deep snow with nothing but a tin lunch and your father's old coat. There were no breaks for childhood. Not in February, not with frost creeping in through the floorboards and wolves howling in the pines. Girls learned to hunt. Boys learned to bake. Everyone knew how to patch a coat, sew a cut, and pray over a fevered brow. The woman of the house didn't call herself strong. She didn't call herself anything, but the evidence was there. A stack of firewood she chopped with a blunted axe, a child fed with the last potatoes from the root cellar, a line of clothes drying beside the stove while the wind slammed the shutters like an angry god. She didn't get credit. Most of the stories went to the men, the traders, the cowboys, the riders. But when spring finally came, and the roads opened, and the neighbors arrived to check in, they often found the same thing. The man was gone. The children were healthy. And the woman, thin, silent, alive, had kept everything standing. In some communities, these women became the local authority. People brought them sick calves, frostbitten fingers, rumors. A kind of quiet respect gathered around them, not because they demanded it, but because everyone knew if the roads closed tomorrow, she'd make it through. Not all did. Some cracked, some wept silently over broken plates. Some lost children and went quiet forever. Others buried husbands in the snow and kept their grief folded tight in their apron like a hidden letter. But even in that grief, they endured, and that endurance passed down. In stories, yes, but also in habits, in recipes that used almost nothing, in coats patched 3 times instead of tossed, in the way a granddaughter lit a fire with dry moss and calm hands, no panic, no waste. That was the inheritance. Not gold, not land, just strength. The kind you don't sit right down, the kind you live through. The land kept their secrets. You could walk through a thicket of pines in Montana, or a drifted gulch in Idaho, and never know a woman once built a cabin there with her own hands, that she birthed 3 children in that cabin, buried one behind it, and slept with a shotgun across her lap for 5 winters straight. But if you knew where to look, the signs remained. A square of stone from a chimney, half buried in snow, rusted pans hanging on a nail driven into a cottonwood, an old pair of boots, leather cracked like bark, half frozen in the earth, where she must have taken them off in the dark and never put them back on. She was real, even if no one wrote her name in a ledger, even if the preacher never came to mark the grave, even if her children left and her story stayed behind with the wind and the birds and the wolves that returned each spring. Not all made it. The winters were long. Cabin fever was real. Not just boredom, but an ache that settled in the bones and scraped at the mind. Some lost themselves out there. Others left warnings, scratched messages on the walls. Do not stay here. Food gone. Snow too high. River not safe. A Bible left open to Psalms. A child's name carved into the windowsill, a dress, folded neatly, never worn again. But some outlasted it all. They lived into old age, moved into town, ran boarding houses or post offices, told stories that no one believed until someone else spoke up and said, "I remember her. She came through the blizzard when my sister was sick. She brought birch bark tea and held her hand until morning." They weren't sit, seeking glory, but they didn't sit hide either. When spring came and the snows pulled back, they walked into town in coats they had patched themselves, boots they had resoled 3 times, and eyes that had seen the inside of true cold. They weren't gentle, but they were kind. They didn't suffer fools, but they fed them anyway. And people listened when they spoke, not because of their age, or their gender, or even their wisdom, but because they had survived. In a landscape that killed strong men and swallowed whole families, they had stood their ground, year after year, storm after storm. They had written no journals, left no memoirs, but they built legacies in the lives they saved, the children they raised, the trails they broke. And sometimes, deep in the woods, someone still finds a stone fire ring, a rusted axe, and initials carved into the doorframe of what used to be home. She was here. She survived the winter. She never waited for permission, and she never stayed inside. Trains, tunnels, and the blizzard crews who fought the snow. The train tracks looked safe in summer. They cut clean across valleys, hugged ridgelines, and wound through tunnels bored by sweat, dynamite, and death. But when winter came, those same tracks became traps, invisible under snowdrifts, iced over in shadowed canyons, buried alive under avalanches that gave no warning. Still, the trains had to run. Mail, coal, passengers, military supplies, telegraph cables, medical shipments. Entire frontier towns depended on those trains arriving on time, in one piece, and not entombed under a mountain of snow. That meant someone had to clear the way. Enter the blizzard crews. They were railroad men, yes, but they didn't lay tracks or build bridges. Their job started after the storm. When everything else shut down, they showed up, armed with snowplows, pickaxes, shovels, and steam. They rode straight into whiteouts with one goal: keep the line open. In the mountain passes of Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, and British Columbia, the snowfall was relentless. Storms dropped 10 feet in a day. Winds turned cuts and switchbacks into death traps. Wooden snow sheds, built to protect the track, sometimes caught fire or collapsed from the weight. Avalanches wiped out entire sections in seconds. Still, the trains kept coming. And if they didn't, the towns they served started to starve. That pressure created some of the most daring and dangerous. At the front of the train sat the rotary snowplow. It looked like a steel monster, a giant spinning blade powered by its own steam engine, chewing through snow like a buzz saw through bone. Behind it came the work crew, bundled in wool, gripping poles, axes, and shovels, ready to dig, pry, chop, and curse until the tracks reappeared. They called them flangers, wedge plow drivers, tunnel clearers, and track walkers. Flangers cleared the grooves between rails, small, deep tracks that had to be kept clean or derailments would follow. Wedge plows slammed into drifts at full speed, sometimes flying off the rails in the process. Tunnel clearers climbed inside stone corridors, slick with ice and carbon soot, smashing icicles the size of fence posts, clearing snow that had blown in and hardened to the consistency of concrete. And the track walkers, maybe the toughest of all, went out on foot ahead of the train, probing for buried rails with iron rods, trying to find where the avalanche had struck or where one might strike next. They worked fast. Or they froze, gloves iced over, beards turned to frost, eyelashes stuck together. Fingers went numb before they got the second shovel in the ground. Some of them fell off the mountain. Some were buried mid-shift. Others vanished entirely, last seen near mile marker 12, swallowed by the storm. But when it worked, when the line was cleared, when the rotary chewed its way through a 20-foot drift and steam hissed from the stack and black iron burst into the waiting light, it was like parting the sea. The rails were open, the train rolled through, and in towns hundreds of miles away, people exhaled. The coal would come. The letters would arrive. The food would last until the next storm hit. The danger wasn't just snow. It was gravity. Avalanches weren't rare. They were expected. Entire sections of rail were called avalanche zones right on the maps. Crews knew which miles were safe and which ones were rolling the dice. And every time they passed through those white corridors, they listened for cracks, for rumbles, for the deep-bellied roar that meant you were out of time. Sometimes they made it. Sometimes they didn't set. In 1910, 2 trains sat trapped near Wellington, Washington. They'd been snowed in for 6 days. Crews, passengers, mail, waiting for a break in the blizzard. On the 7th day, just after midnight, the mountain gave way. A 10-foot wall of snow, trees, and rocks slammed down from above. It wiped out the train station, the telegraph wires, the engines, and nearly 100 people gone in less than a minute. Some were found buried 40 feet deep. Others were never found at all. That was the worst avalanche disaster in U.S. railroad history. But it wasn't the only one. In the Rocky Mountains, tunnels iced over in strange, deadly ways. Hot steam from the engines condensed on the rock walls, then froze solid. Icicles as long as railroad ties dangled like spears. Crews had to knock them down by hand, fast before they shattered on a head or sliced through a window. Sometimes the tunnel ceilings dripped so steadily they created standing pools of ice along the track. Other times, rockfalls inside the tunnels went unnoticed until the train slammed into them head-on. That SIPs where the tunnel watchmen came in. These were men assigned to walk the tunnels every day, even in storms, inspecting the ceilings and walls with nothing but a lantern and a hammer. They tapped for weak spots, chipped loose ice, cleared minor blockages before they became major ones. They worked alone. If they slipped or the tunnel collapsed behind them, no one knew until it was too late. Worse still were the blizzard wrecks. Sometimes a plow engine went out to clear a drift and never came back. The wind would rise. Visibility dropped to nothing. Tracks vanished. The crew might lose orientation, overshoot a bridge, or hit a patch of ice and derail into a ravine. Recovery didn't come fast. The next train might not even be able to reach them for days. Bodies froze in position. one hand still gripping a shovel, one boot stuck in the stirrup, letters scattered in the snow, unread and unfinished. And still, they returned. The railroad companies fixed the rails, rebuilt the sheds, hired new men. The new crews learned the same lessons. Keep your gloves dry. Never walk into a tunnel without checking for drips. Trust your gut when the slope looks off. If a squirrel won't cross the cut, maybe you shouldn't either. Some called it madness. Others called it duty. But for the men on those trains, engineers, brakemen, firemen, and flangers, it was something else entirely, a fight against silence. Because if the line went quiet, everything down the track went still. And in winter, stillness could mean death. When a train engine freezes, it doesn't set shatter. It groans. The iron contracts. The wheels seize. Steam hisses from frozen valves like something alive trying to breathe. That's how some of the old plow engines died, stuck in snowbanks, too deep to cut through, abandoned mid-route, their fires banked and left to go cold. The crews walked out, or they tried. Sometimes they made it to a siding and lit a fire with telegraph wire and fence posts. Sometimes they followed the tracks in reverse, mile after mile through thigh-high drifts, carrying lanterns that went dim too fast. And sometimes they didn't make it at all. People still find them. Not the people you'd expect. Not historians, but hunters, hikers, snowmobilers. They'll stumble onto a rusted hulk in the timberline, wheels buried, boiler cracked, cab door hanging open like someone's still inside. No markers, no plaques, just frozen steel and silence. That sits where the stories begin. Locals say the train still runs in certain snowstorms. You can hear it, low and distant, chugging through canyons long since abandoned, echoing off ridgelines. No lights, no whistle, just the dull thump of iron and the memory of motion. They call them ghost trains, but not out of superstition, out of memory, because those men didn't vanish. Their labor's still here. The tunnels they dug, the rails they laid, the switchbacks carved from cliffs with picks and dynamite and bare hands. And some of the names remain. You'll find them on maps. Slide names like Snowshed Curve and Avalanche Gulch. Wreck sites listed by milepost, like scars the mountain kept. Tunnels named after engineers who never came back. A marker where two plow crews froze trying to clear the same drift from opposite sides. Some of the old engines are preserved, cleaned, repainted, displayed in railroad museums with floodlights and polished brass. But most just stopped, still waiting on a mountain slope, still pointed toward a town that no longer exists, still wearing the weight of winter like armor. And the strange thing is, some trains still run. Modern plows, electric heat, GPS, insulated cabs. The technology's better, the danger's less, but the mountains haven't changed. The snow still falls, and sometimes it falls too much. And when it does, the plows go out again. Crews suit up, engines growl, and steel presses forward into silence. Because the job hasn't set changed. Clear the line. Keep the route open. Get the cargo through. Get home if you can. And if you can't, at least make sure the train behind you knows where you stopped.